Hello everyone, welcome to the channel, and I'm here for my end of the year list 2020. Now, I thought that this year has been fairly solid for music. Now, at the start of the year, in the first half of the year, I was just thinking that this year was pretty underwhelming with music. I thought that 2019 was way better in terms of new music releases in comparison to this year. But this year actually turned out a little bit better for music than I thought. So I got about 8 albums on this list, which I know is not a lot. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe we're already doing the end of the year list 2020 because we are approaching the end of the year. So let's go ahead and get into this list. And this list will be in a particular order from my least favorite of the year to my favorite of the year. So at the bottom, we got Sevendust with Blood and Stone. Now, this is the follow-up to their last album, All I See Is War, which is the album that got me into the band. And with this album, Blood and Stone, I think it's a really good album. Now, the reason that it's sitting at the bottom of this list is because the album doesn't really have the strongest replay value. I don't return to it a whole lot or anything, but it is a very solid album still, and it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't checked it out already. If you're into hard rock or new metal or anything like that, it's definitely a really great album. I mean, pretty good follow-up to the last album, of course. Now, I will say that the last album, All I See Is War, is just a little bit better than Blood and Stone, but Blood and Stone is still a very good album. There's a lot of great stuff on here. Dying to Live, Love, Blood from a Stone, Criminal. I mean, these are all really great songs. But yeah, Blood and Stone by Sevendust. It's a great album. Definitely had to be on the list. So next up, we got Testament with Titans of Creation. Now, I'll be honest, this is actually my first Testament album, which I know some people might say is not a very good start. You know, oh, Zach, you should have started out with their earlier stuff. And I know I probably should have, but I, of course, wanted to listen to this. So, you know, if I pretty much wanted to decide if I wanted to put this on my end of the year list, but here it is. Now, it is in the bottom half of this list, but I do think it's a great album still. Of course, if you're into thrash metal, you definitely need to check out this album. If you're a Testament fan, you should check out this album, obviously. Yeah, I mean, this album, I mean, it's very riffy. I mean, the riffs in this album definitely are something else. So yeah, that's definitely one of the things that really stand out to me, especially in those first few songs. But yeah, Titans of Creation by Testament. This album had to make the list. While I wasn't mind blown, I do like the album, and I think it was pretty good overall. Next, we got Wobbler with Dwellers of the Deep. Now, a friend of mine, and also a viewer of mine, has recommended me to check out this album, Big Face TV. He wanted me to check out this album, and I gotta say that I really liked it. I think it's definitely a really great album. This album really took me by surprise. Now, this album is very proggy. I would say it's pretty unique. It kind of reminds me of Yes a little bit, especially with the vocals. The vocals especially remind me of the band Yes. But yeah, this album, it's definitely really good. This is my first album hearing from this band too. This album is very proggy, and it's just really really unique and pretty intriguing to listen to. Like I said, took me by surprise. But yeah, pretty impressive album, I'd say. Not sure if it's the best introduction to the band, but I'd be interested in checking out more from Wobbler. I mean, this album is pretty darn good, I'd say. So Dwellers of the Deep by Wobbler. This album had to make the list. Okay, so next up, we got Dark Tranquillity with their album Moments. Now, Dark Tranquillity is one of my favorite melodeath bands, and this album was pretty good. Now, in comparison to this album and the last album, Adama, I still do think I like Adama a little bit more than this album, but this album is still pretty solid nonetheless. I think it's still a really good album. Of course, if you're into melodeath, I mean, definitely check out the album. This album has a lot of solid material. I mean, Phantom Days, great song. But yeah, this album is really good. I mean, you know, Dark Tranquillity, they are a pretty consistent band, and You know, they're definitely more consistent than In Flames because, well, I know that Dark Tranquillity and In Flames do get compared a lot, but this album, Moment, it's a really good album. Again, if you're into melodeath, check it out. This album had to make the list. Moment by Dark Tranquillity. So next up, we got Red with their album Declaration. Now, I will admit, this is another album that doesn't really, you know, it's not really an album that you want to return to a whole lot, but for what this album is, it's pretty darn good, I'd say. And this album is a lot better than the last Red album, Gone, which I do think is Red's weakest album. So Red came back with something heavy. Now, I am a little disappointed that there are no ballads on this album because I usually like Red's ballads. I think they do a really good job when it comes to their ballads. So I don't know, it's a little disappointing that we didn't really get any ballads from this Red album, you know. I feel like maybe this album was kind of maybe rushed out a little bit. That's what it kind of feels like to me, especially since, you know, there's only 10 songs on this album. Most of the songs were released before the album came out, or at least half the songs. So the marketing-wise, this album was just kind of meh, but I think for what this album is, it's a really good album, and it's at least Red's best album since Of Beauty and Rage, for sure. There's a lot of great songs on here. All For You is a really great song. This is a song that's actually grown on me, because before I used to think it was only okay, but it has grown on me a little bit. I think it's a great song, pretty catchy. Cauterize is really good. War We Made, Evening Hates, Sever, one of the best tracks on the album. This album is really solid. If you're into hard rock or alternative metal, definitely check out this album. You know, it's really good. It's pretty heavy. So Red with their newest album, Declaration. This album had to make the list. Of course, I've been a fan of Red for many, many years, so this album is really good. Okay, so next up, we're in the top 3. Next, we got Trivium with What the Dead Men Say. Now, maybe some people might not agree with this being in the number 3 spot, but I don't know, I really dig this album. Now, when it comes to Trivium, they've never released a bad album. I think all their stuff is really great, and this album is certainly without exception. I mean, this was the follow-up to one of their best albums, The Sin and the Sentence, and to me, this album is not as good as The Sin and the Sentence. I still think The Sin and the Sentence is a way better album, but What the Dead Men Say is a pretty good follow-up. Now, I think the problem with What the Dead Men Say is I feel like they didn't really step outside of the box all that much. See, when The Sin and the Sentence came out, it was like Trivium's best album in years, so you know, it was like, you know, really, it was really unique at the time. It was something worth writing home about, I guess. And with this album, What the Dead Men Say, yes, it's a great album, but it's not really anything new. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would expect them, you know, something fresh, you know, something different. To me, this album kind of feels like a Sin in the Sentence B-sides album, but even with that said, it's still a very, very solid album for sure. But that's just one complaint that I do have to make about it. But this album is still very solid. There's a lot of great songs on here, like the title track, Castrofist, The Ones We Leave Behind, The Defiance. I mean, there's a lot of great songs on here. But yeah, so What the Dead Men Say by Trivium, if you're into metalcore or modern metal, definitely check out this album. It's definitely very solid. I mean, Trivium is a very unique band in the metal genre since they combine so many different styles of metal, and this album has all that, so definitely check out this album, What the Dead Men Say by Trivium. Next up at number 2, we got OHMS by Deftones. Now, this album, it really is fantastic. Now, I do think that this album is better than their last album, Gore, which Gore, I think, is actually a pretty good album, but this album really blew that album out of the water, at least in my opinion. This album is definitely fantastic. I mean, I knew that this album would be somewhere in the top 2 of the year, and it's definitely a very solid album. I definitely dig this one. I would say that this is their best album, probably just since Koyo no Kan. But this album is still very solid, though. I mean, it's heavy. I would say one of Deftones' heaviest albums in a while. I've heard some people say in some of their reviews that this album is kind of like a throwback to the 90s and early 2000s days of Deftones, and I can hear that a little bit. But this album is very solid. I mean, you got great songs like Genesis, Error, the title track, Radiant City, and just so many others. This album is just fantastic. I pretty much got no complaints with this album. I mean, the production, the vocals, the riffs, everything is excellent. And funny enough, I became a fan of Deftones earlier this year, so I'm definitely glad I got into them before this album came out. And I really dig this album. I think it's great. So Deftones with their album OHMS, this album had to make the list, and it's sitting at number 2. Please do yourself a favor and check out this album if you haven't already, especially if you're into new metal or alternative metal. So at number 1, you guys might already know what number 1 is for me, and that is Fate's Warning with their album Long Day, Good Night. And I knew that right away this album would be somewhere in the top 3, just by the singles. Whenever they released the first couple of singles, Scars and Now Comes the Rain, like just based on those 2 songs alone, I knew that this album would be somewhere in the top 3 of the year, because those songs were just excellent, and they're still great songs, and this album is just excellent front to back. And this album was, of course, the follow-up to Fate's Warning's last album, Theories of Flight. And Theories of Flight was a great album, probably their best album since Pleasant Shade of Grey or some point in the 90s. But this album, Long Day, Good Night, is a very solid follow-up to Theories of Flight. Yeah, some of my favorites on here would have to be Shuttered World, Scars, Now Comes the Rain, Under the Sun, Alone We Walk, When Snow Falls, The Longest Shadow of the Day. I mean, a lot of great songs on this album. This album is just excellent. I mean, if you're into progressive metal, definitely check out this album. If you're into Fate's Warning, of course, check out the album if you haven't already for some reason. This album is excellent. Now, I'm still kind of figuring out which album I like more, this album or Theories of Flight, because they're both very solid. I think I like them both for different reasons. I think Long Day, Good Night is a more atmospheric sounding album than Theories of Flight is. It's more ambient, I feel like, and I like that about this album. It's definitely very solid. I pretty much got no complaints with this album. Like, even the weaker songs on this album, I think are pretty solid. But yeah, there you have it. Long Day, Good Night by Fate's Warning. It's my number 1 favorite album of 2020. So there you have it, guys. That is my list, my end of the year list 2020. Let me know what you think. What are your favorite albums of the year? You can let me know. Of course, I didn't include one-off ideas like Breaking Benjamin's Aurora or Metallica's S&M 2. But if I were to place those on the list, they would probably be somewhere in the bottom half. Because I know that this year we've been getting a lot of one-off ideas from some bands like that as well, acoustic albums and live albums and stuff like that. But those don't really count when you're talking about end-of-the-year lists, so that's why I didn't include those on this end-of-the-year list video. But nonetheless, those are my favorite albums of 2020. Let me know what you think. What are some of your favorite albums of the year 2020? Of course, you can list me a top 5, a top 3, or even a top 10. Feel free to let me know. So, let me know what you think of my list. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day, and take care.